Welcome to today's TEA webinar, everybody. My name is Erica. I'm the Director of Operations for TEA, and Jenny Nevin, our COO, is also on the call with us to welcome you. If you want to.
Everybody.
Hi, Jenny. We ask that all of you go ahead and edit your names on your little video square so that it has your first and last name and your company so that we know who you are just as we see you throughout the meeting. Let's see. Everyone will be on mute as a courtesy to everyone else, and Roberta and Corey. If you have any questions during the presentation, we ask that you put them into our chat, which I think is on this side for you guys. And once we get into our Q&A session, Roberta will be moderating those, and we'll be able to get as many in as possible by the end. So on that wonderful note, I'm going to hand it off to Roberta Perry to get started today.
Thank you, Erica. Woo! Good morning. I know we give a huge round of applause for our Director of Operations, Erica, who's putting all this together. Our tech master. Whoa! Well, good morning and good day to all of our TEA members across the world. It's exciting for me to be able to be your host this morning and introduce our guest speaker, simply because I miss seeing all of you at the TEA Summit this year. So what a great way to start the morning off for me, to see all of your smiling faces, having coffee, being in there and just relaxing, and hopefully relaxing at home, safe and healthy. I met our guest speaker last year at the Global Gaming Expo. He sat in on one of my discussion groups. And as soon as he sat down and he started asking all these extremely intelligent questions and was just so personable and witty and had a great sense of humor, I went, I'm going to know that man for the rest of my life. And ever since then, we have been working on projects together with several of my clients. And then he gifted me with one of his books, The Market to the Millennial Mindset. I couldn't believe it. It was absolutely outstanding. And then on top of that, I invited him to IAPA in November. He came there, his company joined the TEA, and the rest is history. He was going to be our guest speaker at Day One Summit. So to be able to have him on today talking about his favorite topic of forging stronger relationships while social distancing.
My favorite topic.
First, yeah, I know. First, let me do a very quick introduction of Corey. Corey Padman is an industry-leading marketing data expert with extensive experience building strategies with worldwide brands. He is a partner at T2 Marketing International, a communication and marketing consultancy company founded in 1986. They have stayed ahead of the curve when it comes to digital, social, mobile, and data-centric marketing. He's worked with brands ranging from the hospitality industry to tech to entertainment to government. And all of you who know me know that I always ask the question to our speakers, what is it that you're not telling us in these professional introductions? And Erica and I had the chance to ask Corey that this last week when we were meeting, and Corey told us that he collects, are you ready for this? He collects antique shoehorns. Now I know there's a story behind that, but you never know. Corey's going to do his presentation, Forging Stronger Relationships while social distancing, over the next 30 minutes. Then we're going to open up for Q&A. Now the Q&A will come in through the chat room, so please send your question to everybody, because we assume that if one person has a question, many people might have that question. So feel free to question. Now, if we don't get to all the questions, which I assume we won't, then Corey has agreed to take all those questions, answer them, and we'll send a document out to it. So everyone, a Zoom TEA big welcome to Corey Padman, our guest speaker today.
Hey. Oh, so kind. Thank you so much, Roberta. Yeah, it's always, I mean, I always wonder if the shoehorn thing was a chicken or egg. Did I start collecting the shoehorn so I could tell people about it, or do I just enjoy telling people about it because it's such a quirky thing to collect? But thank you very much for the intro. I also want to thank everybody for being here, everybody on the West Coast. I know that it's early, so thanks for joining me for your morning coffee. Everybody on the East Coast, thanks for joining me in that weird quarantine 11 a.m. slot where you're wondering if it's too early to eat lunch and then have a second lunch again at 3 o'clock. So I appreciate everybody being here for whatever time it is. Everybody in between, congratulations. You're here at a pretty normal hour in the morning. So again, I appreciate everybody taking the time here. I know that I was very much looking forward to being there with you at the summit. Looking forward to seeing you all when we get back together at the summit reschedule. And I figured, why not, while we're in this interim period, sitting at home, watching webinars all day long, jump in there and share something with everybody that's probably a little bit different. And right now, frankly, pretty important. We've been focusing in on social communication for a long time, and it's an area that has obviously, without any surprise to anyone, really exploded in terms of its value, in terms of its applications, in terms of its sort of permeability into every single component of day-to-day business. And yet, it's still something that is pretty elusive when it comes to the core centric strategy that applies to business growth, business development, and ultimate business goals. It's been so often it's been looked at as sort of the silo, and it's been sort of relegated to the side when people take on social, take on digital communications. We've been focusing largely on some of the platforms that we're a little bit more familiar with, which is understandable considering how quickly social has evolved, how rapidly and often it changes. So taking a hold of it and applying it to day-to-day business is something that you really need to be devoting a huge amount of time and resources to, and it's just something that the majority of us don't really have the time to do. I mean, I spend my entire day focusing in on these kinds of platforms, and I also have to wake up every morning and read through everything that's been announced, because every single day there's a whole bunch of new things that we need to know about. So why not take a bunch of that information and put it all together and present it to everyone so you don't have to spend any time doing the research that I did for you. So that's the idea. So just to go over really quick here what we're going to talk about today, just want to make sure that everybody can see my screen here. Today's agenda is focused largely on three main topics. I know it seems a little odd that we would focus in on three topics, and none of those three actually says social media or new media, but those are the three core areas that I really want to focus in on, because frankly, those are the three core areas that are going to help build both long and short-term strategies, long and short-term programs that are going to ultimately help you take hold of these new media, take hold of social channels, and build these programs and these strategies that are ultimately going to help develop these relationships that, while we're social distancing now, and this is effectively one of, if not the only means of communicating with the public, this is an area that we could continue to move forward with, and that we could start to scale up both in terms of our use of these platforms, as well as the value that these platforms are adding to our day-to-day. So what are the three areas? First, I want to talk about data. I'm sure that everybody here has heard a lot about data. I'm sure that data, and if you pronounce it data, my apologies for such a divisive use of, and if you pronounce it divisive, then my apologies for if you pronounce it divisive. But for such a divisive use of pronunciation, but we're talking about data and its centric value to these strategies. Now, why is it that we are talking about data? And that's because we have at our fingertips more data, access to more information, and more value in that data than we've really ever had in the entirety of human existence. I know that sounds like hyperbole, but I assure you it is not. I'm sure a lot of you have heard the classic fun fact that 92% of the world's data has been created in the last 3 years. That's just because every single day we're providing so much information out there that it's piling on and on and on. And frankly, it is extremely burdensome to try and get hold of everything that's out there unless you know what you're looking for. That's kind of the goal that I'd like to focus in on when it comes to data, when it comes to analytics, is that this is something that can be taken advantage of whether you are a global conglomerate. If you have 500,000 employees and you're operating worldwide, well then it should come as no surprise that getting access to that data and mining for that and putting that together in a series of strategies is something that you obviously have the capability to do. You also have the capability to start leveraging this data if you are a one-person operation, if you are working out of your home, if you are sitting and wondering if there's any information out there that you could take advantage of on a personal or professional level. Well, the answer is yes. And that's kind of the idea that I'm leaning towards, is focusing in on what exactly can we do as individuals to start taking advantage of the data that's out there, and frankly, data that we already have that we may not have even started to look at because we may not have even known where it was. That's part A, and you think that we're going to get through everything in a half hour. Well, get ready. It's going to be a roller coaster ride. Part B, strategy. What exactly can we do once we have started to find this data, once we have started to structure and analyze what this information is, what it's telling us? Where can we go? What kinds of strategies can we put in place that are going to effectively lead to the short and long-term objectives that we've laid out for ourselves even before social distancing? Now that we're looking at a digital world where virtually everything that we're doing is virtual, how can we start to build these strategies from the data that we're collecting and develop ultimately communications efforts that are going to connect with people on a much more personal and much deeper level? We're in an industry here that is known for providing experiences. We're in an industry here that is ultimately designed to give people those lasting connections, both to what it is we're doing, as well as to their own past, to their own history. So how can we start to provide those kinds of experiences, provide those kinds of interactions by better understanding our audience through the use of some of these data points? And the last third point that I'd like to go over today is how we as an industry can start to leverage some of the inherent creativity that exists across this entire industry in order to lead to faster turnarounds, building those relationships in a shorter time period, leveraging, once again, the data and the strategies that we've put together in order to effectively communicate and connect with our audiences in creative ways that we may not have thought of doing before. So if that all sounds good to everybody, then we can go ahead and get started with our conversation. Now, data is something that I am intimately familiar with. My background is actually in econometrics, and I know that you're probably thinking to yourself, hey, econometrics, the natural progression is to get into a creative marketing focus, right? Of course. So my focus, though, was in largely econometrics, econometric modeling, economic forecasting, which is extremely exciting to me. If you are not excited by numbers and math, well then, sorry, you're not going to love some of the stuff that we need to do. But luckily, we have plenty of plugins, plenty of tools, and plenty of access points that don't require you to have any sort of advanced knowledge of econometric modeling. So how do we start getting into data from here? I think one of the big misconceptions that a lot of us have is that if you are not in an enormous publicly traded company listed on the New York Stock Exchange, then you can't use data, that it's not something that's readily available. I'm sure that a lot of us have never even considered where we could find this data. Now, that's not true, because in the last few years, like I mentioned, data has just grown exponentially just with the use of these new media. Now, we tend to work largely in a physical spectrum. So we don't necessarily focus too much on, let's say, our website analytics, the affinity categories that people register based on website tracking. If I'm scaring you because you think Google is watching, well, I hate to break it to you, but they are. And luckily for us, now that we're sitting at home and we need to start figuring out ways to connect with people, Google has provided us with, and as well as all these other channels, has provided us with huge amounts of information that share with us exactly what people are thinking, what they're doing, how they're interacting, not just with our brands, not just with our organizations, but with our industries, with our competitors in certain cases. And all of that information is largely readily available for free. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of options that exist where we could start to pay for these services. But as far as access to our data, there are things like Google Analytics. I'm sure a lot of us are using Google Analytics, and we're not even aware of some of the depths with which we can start to dive into understanding our audiences. There are some of the more advanced capabilities like Google Tag Manager. If you have a little bit more advanced tracking on your website, if you have a little bit more advanced tracking capabilities on the platforms that you're using, with the campaigns that you're running, there is Google Tag Manager. We have social analytics, Facebook analytics, we have mobile analytics. The amount of data that exists are so broad and so detailed that it's amazing that it isn't being taken advantage of by more. I mean, I know that it's easy to overlook these things when we're focused in on our primary business objective. And that's why it's of no fault to anyone when they see these things and they're sort of blown away by what we're seeing. One of the areas that I think is worth noting is that new media data capabilities provide us with insights into our audiences that we otherwise really would never have known about. Those areas include things like psychographics, which you could see here on the screen. What are psychographics exactly? Well, it's exactly what you're seeing here. It's values, it's interests, it's affinity categories, which is a category that exists. If you look into Google Analytics, you jump into your audience and you start to look into audience behaviors, you could start to learn more about what people are interested in, what kinds of websites they've visited, what types, and start to create segments within those data, all completely free and available, where you could actually start to dive into, okay, people who visited my website from Facebook, what were the pages they visited and what were the other types of websites they've visited before? Now, why is that important? Because it starts to give us insights into two main areas. First, it provides us with insights into what the psychographic qualities are that make up the audiences that are most engaged with our content, with our media, and with our communication strategies. And two, it may provide us with some insights into areas that we would have otherwise never considered visiting. If we had a strategy that focused on, I want people who are made up of X, Y, and Z, well, we may have completely overlooked the fact that people from A, B, and C are actually visiting, engaging, and providing us with a little hint that, hey, we're a viable market. We are here to engage with you, and you may want to consider reaching out to us. That right there is a prime example of one of the major things that people one of the major opportunities that people tend to miss out on, because the focus is so much on, here's the audience that I've created for myself, without ever thinking, well, which audiences are out there that may be reaching out to me that I've overlooked? And that speaks to another point that I really want to harp on with data, and that's that in this period where we are all working remotely and thereby working on our computers, we are all trying to reach our audiences using digital media, using new media. There's one area that we need to continually remind ourselves of, and that's the fact that we cannot let any single moment across the journey, the visitor journey, whether it's on our website, whether it's on one of these social channels, wherever it might be, We can't allow any one of those moments to go by where we're not at least trying to collect a little bit of information so that we can start to reach out to people. Now, whether that's asking people to like our page, whether that's asking people to download an ebook, subscribe to a newsletter, provide some sort of information to us so that we can continue the conversation in a one-to-one basis as opposed to a one-to-many, being our website to the world. We want to be able to find ways to communicate with people much more personally, and that's going to come from accessing or letting them access information that we've stored for ourselves. So that could be in the form of, let's say, an ebook, asking them to register for a webinar like this, where when people provide you the information, now you could say, hey, look at that. John Smith, whom I've never met, never seen, is saying that they're interested in this bit of information that I have shared here. I would have pegged John Smith based on the demographics that I've outlined as someone who would have been interested in A, but he filled out the form here that's asking for information related to B, and now I have a completely different understanding of that user base. Collecting that information is not necessarily the simplest of things in every case. I mean, you may need to create a form on your website if you don't already have any. You may need to input certain plugins for, if you're using WordPress, that you could put in a form plugin. There are free form plugins that you can put in there. There are capabilities that exist to provide you with data collection mechanisms on Facebook, on Instagram, virtually any one of the channels that exists in this social sphere, which we call it, has the capability to collect data, analyze the users who are visiting, and now create tailored, customized communication strategies that are catered to the exact specifications that have been outlined by those individuals. And that's a big part of the third and last point I want to talk about when it comes to data, and that's segmentation. You have at your fingertips, like I mentioned, an enormous repository of data that exists across a multitude of channels. That's all well and good. The problem is that when you pull that all out and you put it together in one big, giant, convoluted Excel sheet, it's ugly, it's clunky, and frankly, it's not doing you a huge amount of favors. So one of the things that you want to do, and this is actually part of what's in the checklist, which will be distributed today following a set of where do we go from here type points. One of the things that you'll really want to do is you'll want to conduct a pretty comprehensive audit of the data assets that you have, figure out what the data is telling you, and you're going to want to start to outline exactly how you can segment the existing information you have, which could exist simply by you could pull out your Facebook audience and run analysis on that audience. You could pull out your email database and run an analysis on that database. There are a lot of different ways to analyze your audience and segment that information. That way, you could start to build creative communication strategies that are tailored specifically to the audience or to the platform where you're trying to achieve those goals. Simple enough, right? All very easy stuff, simple step-by-step stuff, so don't worry about it. I'm sure you could figure it all out. Once we have a control of our data, which is admittedly going to take a little bit of time, but it's not something that is hugely burdensome. It's something that we could do. As you've seen, there are free assets. We have information readily available. So once we start to take control of that information, once we start to learn a little bit more of our audience, and we have identified the areas where there's huge opportunity for us to build those relationships where the audience is already engaging with us, and we can actually extend our communications to an area or another. That's when we want to start creating some of these custom strategies that are designed to communicate effectively on each one of the channels where we have decided to pursue those goals. Now, before we get into that, one of the things I want to make very clear is that I have one of the main areas where I have consistently found pitfalls for organizations or individuals that are trying to get a stronger grasp on their digital or social communications is in going too far and too extensive with the number of channels that they're using. I think in part of the audit that I discussed in the checkpoints that are going to be distributed, one of the things you want to take stock of is, based on the objectives that you've outlined for yourself, based on the audiences that you're trying to reach and the audiences that you have outlined from the analysis of your data and the insights across the channels you're using. You want to figure out where is it most effective for you to be spending your time and communicating across these channels. I know that it is extremely tempting to see something and jump onto the bandwagon of I should be here because all of my friends are talking about this TikTok thing, so I should be on TikTok, and I just need to get an account and start posting stuff there. I'm sure everybody here has seen TikTok pop up in some form or another. Well, you really want to take a step back from the trend and the data. I mean, I'm sure, there's plenty of stories out there of some of these platforms hitting 500 million users in 2 months. Well, that's great, but you want to ask yourself, does it make sense for me to be there based on who's there, based on what my objectives are, and based on, frankly, my bandwidth? Do you have the time? Do you have the resources to devote to creating strategies, to creating communications initiatives for 15 different platforms? If you're planning on using Facebook Live for a live event, a live Q&A, do you also need to be creating Instagram Live and Zoom webinars, et cetera, when you really may be working on all of this on your own? In order to limit the high wire dance that you're going to be putting together in doing all this stuff by yourself or in doing all this stuff in a small team, you really want to take stock of where it makes the most sense for you to achieve those objectives, where it makes the most sense for you to create content, where you have content that might be readily available to use on those networks, and determine, okay, it makes sense for me to be on Facebook, it makes sense for me to be on Instagram. I don't see much value in using Snapchat, I don't see much value in using TikTok, so I'm going to focus my efforts on these two as opposed to trying to jump onto 25 different platforms because I've heard about them in the news. Once you have decided where it is you'd like to have that presence, then we can start getting into our content development strategy. This is my favorite little diagram that outlines the keys for effective communications across social channels. What is at the center is really, quite frankly, the most important thing to remember when it comes to creating valuable content. That value, or when it comes to creating effective content, and the key to that is creating value, adding value to the users that you're trying to reach. I know it sounds pretty simple, pretty simplistic in terms of its explanation. It may sound a little lofty in terms of what it means, but if you look around this diagram and you look at what's at the center and what the key components are that make up this value, you'll start to understand a little bit more about how best to build these stronger connections, build these more lasting connections, and frankly, build an objective-oriented set of communication strategies around the content that you're sharing. So what exactly is value? Value is, obviously, it's sort of an intangible. So me trying to explain what value is a pretty subjective explanation, seeing as how everyone here is going to think of value-added content in a different sort of light. But what we really want to consider is, how is the content that you're sharing going to be something worth engaging with when there's already so much more content out there that your audience can turn to? I think that's probably the easiest way to understand value, is what are you providing that people are going to be happy to see in the feed that they're scrolling through? Now, that's a simple enough question. The answer, however, is a little harder to pin down because it comes largely from understanding who your audience is. Now we've gone full circle to come back to our data. See that? It was all part of the narrative. So basically what we're looking to do is figure out, once we understand our audience, what kind of content is it that is going to engage with them? And remember, that value add, that proposition that you're going to be providing is likely going to shift in some way or another from one channel to another. Now, granted, if you have, let's say, take a webinar like today, for example. This is something that is, it exists in this little bubble for all of us to share in. We all know that it's taking place on Zoom. So sharing this information, which is of value because it's provided, I hope, fingers crossed. But it is of value because it's providing people with a webinar, with a time, with something to put aside. We are able to share the same kind of content to promote this across Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, et cetera, et cetera. Where we're talking about different types of value add exists with other types of content that you may want to create. So, as far as what kinds of content are largely effective when it comes to these kinds of media, these are just a couple of the areas that I've found have been extremely successful in terms of building engagement. Obviously, having this kind of information or having these kinds of contents created is going to shift from one channel to another. It's going to shift from one organization to another. But I will say that behind the scenes is, and this is, if ever there was an industry that is aptly prepared for behind the scenes insights and engagement based content, it's this one. Behind the scenes content is hugely valuable. It is an area that is it is an area that is particularly engaging when it comes to social. It's an area where we're able to provide very short snippets. I mean, keeping in mind that the online, and I mentioned this in my book, the average online attention span of adults is about 6 seconds. If you want to put that into context, the average attention span of a goldfish is about 9. So if you want to share snippets of information, behind the scenes snapshots, tips and tricks, easily digestible visual content, those are really the areas where you're going to grab quick hold of your audience, provide them with that value, provide them with a reason to keep coming back, and then you could start to get into some of the longer form content that keeps people engaged, that similar to the webinar that we have here. You could start to do things like live interviews, live video. I'm sure, as you've noticed, has become hugely popular across all of these media. The usage of, I believe there's a 46% increase in Instagram Live and a 50 some odd percent increase in Facebook Live video in the last month. People still want to talk to each other. They still want to engage, and live video is a way to do that. The level of engagement that we're seeing from these kinds of media has gone up significantly, but in order to get the same way that we're seeing a proliferation of the use of these channels, it also means that we need to consider how are we going to get them in the door if there are so many doors for them to walk through. And that comes from using the understanding of this audience, using the data that we've analyzed, the audience insights that we've developed, and building out strategies that first get their attention, get them to keep coming back over and over again because you've provided them with the tips, you've provided them with fun Q&As, you've provided them with a little bit of behind-the-scenes content, and now you could dive into some of that longer form content that is designed to share a message, collect information, showcase your value to that audience. Remember, value added is the key to developing any sort of engaging content, and really start to build a strategy that is designed to engage people both in the short term with some of those quick snippets, but also in the long term. Figuring how can people start to identify you from 100 miles away with a degree of brand consistency? How can people start to identify that this is a piece of content that I'm going to like because I've liked so much of what's been shared before? That's really the thing that you need to keep in mind when you're putting these programs and these strategies together, is how can I get them on the hook and then dive into some of these longer term objectives that can be leveraged through the use of these new media. So that's where we look at the short-term value and the long-term value. Those are the two questions that we really want to keep in mind. Now, as far as the third point that I'd like to get into today, it's a little bit of a focus on the industry, a little bit of focus on what do we do if we have all these ideas, we have these big plans, and I'd like to start engaging with my audience, et cetera, et cetera. Well, how do I start creating this content? What do I start to do? That comes down to sort of leveraging the inherent creativity that exists in our audience, in this industry. Now, I think that I have a couple of examples here, which I think are pretty well poised to showcase what we could start to do. Now, obviously, take an example like Disney. Disney is, that I mentioned before, that enormous organization, global. They've got more than enough resources to be able to put these things together. But if you look at what Disney's done here with Galaxy's Edge, it is a use of that behind-the-scenes insights in order to get people excited. I'm sure a lot of you were either there or saw the huge, huge crowds that were desperate to get in on day one when Galaxy's Edge opened up. The reason for a lot of the momentum is not just because it's Disney and they have a budget, but it's also because they let people feel like they were part of the story. Letting people see behind the scenes, how often has Disney opened up that, pulled back that curtain and let you see these magical worlds in construction? Well, that led to people actually following along, getting excited, planning trips around the opening, and going to see Galaxy's Edge through the use of exclusively digital media, digital content. Some of it was live video, some of it was some of these longer videos, but it was really the use of the creative process that went into the development in order to build the connection with the audience and ultimately leverage people to engage in person. Now you're probably saying, well, sure, that's nice. Disney's got how many people working on their creative teams? What kind of extensive reach do they have? What do I do if I'm an individual who's having a hard time putting these things together? Well, if you jump on to Facebook Live or if you jump on to YouTube and you type in blueprints, you're an architect, you're wondering, how can I start to engage with my audience? Well, you have an opportunity here to actually show them show them a step-by-step. You look at some of the videos that are shared up there. Some of them are live videos. Some of them are simply created, edited, and posted online. There are a multitude of options that exist if you're simply filming from overhead. You look at the first one on this list here. If you're filming from overhead and you simply are drawing out, explaining what people could do, you don't necessarily need to have an extensive budget or extensive team behind you to put that together. You don't necessarily need to have an enormous audience in place in order to generate some success from that. But you can leverage that to showcase some insights or to showcase some value to your audience. I was on a webinar a little while ago. And one of the questions that came up was I mentioned Quora, and I'm not sure how many people here are familiar with Quora, but Quora it's a Q&A forum. It's an excellent resource for finding answers. I asked about one morning. I was watching something, and I asked about the ethno-linguistic roots of East Asian tribes in the pre-16th century, and I got an answer within half an hour. So there's plenty of people on there, plenty of people who know lots of things, and it's a key source for providing value. It's also an area where you could start to create these videos and create a very well-rounded strategy where you could share this to other areas, providing that value, getting people engaged, and driving them to your website, where the entire social sphere that you've created becomes a very cohesive unit driving home these short and long-term goals. So it's a question of thinking creatively in terms of how you can use multiple assets or use a single asset on multiple channels in order to build your brand, connect with your audience, and showcase your value to them. The last of this creative component that I'd like to touch on is the use of live video. I mentioned it before. I'll mention it again. I'm sure everybody here has engaged in some way or another, whether it's through a webinar, obviously everyone here is engaged with live video because here we are. So, but I'm sure everybody here has seen a lot of live content popping up. I'm sure a lot of people have noticed the use of live media, the use of these interactive media forms has really taken hold recently. It's not to say that everybody needs to get involved with it, but it is a very, very good way of connecting with your audience on a much more personal level. If you create something, you spend weeks working on it, you edit it, you harp on little details, and you post it online, it might look good, it might be very effective, but it's missing the small personal element that is going to lead to that ultimate connection, which comes from engaging with people in a live environment. That doesn't mean everybody needs to be doing live video. It does, you can be engaging with live chat. You can be engaging with people in a live conversation, even jumping into a Reddit thread and sharing your insights on Reddit, or I mentioned Quora, jumping in there and getting involved in a conversation there. But getting involved in live communication, it is raw. It showcases a degree of humanization to companies. It sort of adds a face to the brand, and it's an extremely effective way of communicating with people that can really lead to a much stronger personal connection, both to your organization and to the company and to the individuals that you're trying to reach. Now, before we dive into our last little bit, before we dive into some questions, I do want to touch just really quickly on where do we, well, I guess that's where we go. Where do we go here? Come on, there we go. So, if we're looking at come on, buddy, we were doing so well. And there we go. So where do we go from here? There are obviously plenty of areas that we can go from here. I think that in the checklist that I have going out to everybody, there's a lot of different points, a lot of different things that we want to take stock of before we get started with a lot of these strategies. But as far as just a couple of key steps that we could take as soon as we get off the phone here, first and foremost, you want to start setting up some of these long and short-term objectives. I think that one of the big issues that we're faced with is the fact that we sort of jump into these media thinking that it's all going to figure itself out, that it'll be self-explanatory, and that we could sort of play it by ear and see how things go. The reality is that it's easy to think of them that way because there's so much of it that isn't geared towards business. There's so much of it that is focused almost entirely on personal aspects. But as an organization that's trying to leverage these media, that's trying to build these longer term strategies, we need to set up both short and long-term goals. So even if you set something up simply like, I want to build the ratio of people visiting my website or filling out information on my website that came from this channel. It could be something simple like that, or it could be something along the lines of, I'd like to increase the business I generate from online leads by X% over the next 12 months. You want to think about how you could tie these media channels, the connections that you're developing, into business goals. Second thing that we should be doing is taking stock of what we already own. Now, I mentioned data at the beginning. There is probably a huge amount of information that you didn't even realize you had that you'll be pretty surprised to find once you dive in to the back ends of your Facebook page, of your website, of your email database, wherever it might be. You'll probably be surprised to find that there's a lot of information in there that you can already start to leverage and create it and start to create strategies from data that you may not have even known you had. Next, from the information that you're analyzing, from the inventory that you've taken stock of, you're going to want to start to create some target audiences. Now, that's not to say you don't already have them. You may have already outlined the audiences that you're trying to reach. If you're targeting a very small subset of people, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't be leveraging these media in order to showcase your value to the broader audience, which ultimately leads to targeting a much smaller demographic of potential customers by showcasing, look at the engagement my content's had, look at the creativity that we've shared with a broader audience. Now I want to engage with this small demographic of people who qualify as potential customers. Fourth, we want to start looking at how we can start to leverage content. There is a huge amount of content that probably already exists in our back pockets. The key is starting to take stock of that, outlining what it is we could use the content for, figuring out which channels this content is best used on, and then start to create some of these segmented strategies for engagement and outreach across each one of these channels. That comes with that next point of data tracking. We want to make sure that we are constantly collecting information wherever we possibly can. Again, we're not necessarily, if you do have a small subset of prospective clients, if you do have, if you're really zeroed in on a specific industry where it's only a small group of people who may work with you, that's not necessarily to say that you can't leverage these media to build a stronger connection with a broader audience, to establish credibility, to showcase your value both to the public and to that small group of people that may be prospective clients. There's a lot that can come out, both tangible and intangible value from the use of these media connecting with broader audiences, not just customer-centric. And lastly, that's where you're going to want to factor in how you're measuring what you're doing. What are the key performance indicators? Is it a question of audience growth? Is it a question of engagement? Is it a question of lead generation? Figure out exactly what those indicators are, and then establish your benchmarks that are going to track exactly what constitutes success. If you wanted to grow by X% and you succeeded that by an additional 2%, congratulations, that's your benchmark. The one thing I always mention to people is, how could you possibly know if you've succeeded when you have no idea what you're measuring for in the first place? That's why establishing these benchmarks, establishing these performance indicators is really crucial at the outset. And from there, you could start to increase or change those around based on the results that you've seen from the campaigns that you're executing. With that, I know that there's a lot of stuff in there, so I'll leave it to Roberta to dive in. But thanks, everybody, for sitting through. I know it's a lot to take in at 8 o'clock in the morning.
Thank you, Corey. Wow.
My pleasure.
Packed in a lot of information in 35 minutes worth.
Sure.
Thank you for doing that. Now, we've had some incredibly good questions that have come up on the chat. I'm going to focus in on the first question that came up on the chat room, and then I want you to take a look at, there's been some discussion going on NDAs. So we'll cover that second. Yeah. But first, this one I found very interesting. Have you found that in some cases showing how the sausage gets made actually turns audiences off or away from the final content?
Well, I would argue that it's something that we saw a long time. I mean, unless you're actually making sausage, which I would avoid, throwing that onto your live videos. But if you're talking about showing the way things are done, if you look at some of the videos, I think one of the things that I've found is really fun to watch is costume design for epic scale shows. So there are videos that are out there for things like Game of Thrones costume design. There are things that are out there for Lord of the Rings costume design. When it comes to showing how these worlds get made, one of the things that you want to keep in mind is that nothing that you create is being forced onto anybody. So when you are creating content, if you're creating a video, or if you're showing a quick makeup tutorial, if you're showing a quick blueprint design of or 3D AutoCAD rendering of here's how we made this world come to life, you aren't forcing anyone to watch that content if it's not something that they're necessarily interested in. So you are able to showcase what's being done. You are able to showcase, here's how we do this, or here's what makes this look so magical. I think that lighting is an area that also gets a ton of interest from people, because it shows, by doing these small little things, it's like DIY videos of here's how you could make professional grade photography from things around your house. You're seeing a lot of that content come about now, and I think that it doesn't necessarily turn people off, because remember that the content is being tailored to people who have shown and expressed interest in what it is you're offering. So you're not. Okay. So the person who doesn't want to believe, who wants to believe in the magic and isn't interested in seeing how the sausage gets made, so to speak, you're able to. Those people aren't going to be watching the video, and you got to keep in mind that you're creating this content for a specific audience, not necessarily for the broad audience. And I think that's what gets lost in a lot of cases, is that not everything you make is for everybody. It's for the people you identified from that data audit.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, go ahead and focus your attention, if you can, Corey, on the chat, and Pat. started asking a question that we've been talking back and forth on about the NDAs.
Sure.
Because everybody on the call,
yeah.
all of the TEA, we all are faced with NDAs. So how,
Right.
and that use of that. So if you could look at Pat's first question and respond to the NDA comments.
So one of the things I want to take note of here is obviously, you know, behind the scenes. I mentioned Disney when I use there just because I think that the Galaxy's Edge is one of my favorite examples of sausage being made and then the end result being a huge amount of opening day success. When it comes to behind the scenes, however, one of the things I want to note is obviously NDAs are huge focal points for a lot of these cases, and certainly I'm not saying we want to start finding ways to work around. What I'm saying is more about you as an individual. So if you're an individual, or you're a small organization, or even if you're a big organization, I'm not talking about projects. I'm talking about showcase your value in what you do and how you do it. So, you know, answering questions and showing what your studio looks like, obviously without showing anything that's protected. But if you have a studio, let's say you create claymation videos. If you have a studio where you can show a little pet project that you're working on and say, look, this is how we do stop motion video. People love to see that kind of content. And if you really need to focus in on you as the professional, as the expert, rather than the projects, because that's what people find most engaging in the behind the scenes, is seeing more about your process, your knowledge. You know, the video I showed, or the set of videos that were up there about architects, that's showing here's how to draw this part of a blueprint. Here's how we note this kind of information. Here's how we take a blueprint and turn it into a 3D model. Here's how our 3D printer works when we're creating a 3D model. That's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about when I mention behind the scenes. I'm not necessarily saying behind the scenes of an existing project that is under an NDA. It's more about your own personal behind the scenes, which again builds the relationship on a personal level with the audience.
Good. Thank you, Corey. Another question that came in from, if you want to focus in on our gentleman from Gameatronics. The question, could you suggest any tools to find where our target audience is present in a social media platform? We want to create a survey targeting, if you can read that, targeting guest visitors to know how they wish to experience parks post-lockdown.
So one of my favorite ways of creating survey content, obviously, you know, there are ways of doing it for free. If you want to create a survey or a poll, an anonymous poll on, say, Twitter, Facebook, you can create surveys and polls to get that kind of information from people. If you want to get something that's a little bit more sophisticated from a statistical standpoint, Google surveys. If you just go to surveys.google.com, there are mechanisms in place for you to start creating surveys, polls. Those can be adjusted for margin of error. You can adjust those for population size, targeting size. Those, however, can cost money. If you're looking to do, what is it? It's for a 95% margin of error in the United States, you would need a sample size of 1,667 people. You could run those surveys if you're looking for a simple A or B or choose one of the following type surveys. You can get data from that audience within that margin of error, evenly distributed by Google's own placing of those surveys. You can get that for about 25-30 cents a result, which is obviously hugely more cost effective than if you're going to run even a small survey or a small focus group that could cost you $20,000-$30,000 to do it effectively. So just getting those kinds of flash polls, flash surveys, a rolling survey, which is something that we've done in the past when we just want to continue. We've done for an economic development project, it was just constantly gathering information and updating, seeing how people were shifting perceptions. You could run surveys like that that are much more cost effective than traditional surveys using Google surveys. You could also, again, if you have a large email database, or if you're working with an audience, let's just say if you and 3 partners three partner groups all want to subsidize a survey for the industry, you could all, if the four of you want to all send out a survey questionnaire to your existing audience. The thing that people tend to overlook is that everybody is pretty friendly when you ask them something. So if people are already part of your network and you say, hey, I'd really appreciate it a lot if you would help me out by answering this quick survey, it'll be a lot more effective than we think, because people are pretty receptive to that.
Right, good. Thanks, Corey. I know we're running out of time, but there's one, Audrey O'Connell sent in an excellent question that said, what are your recommendations for the best format for a live interview? But more than that, what happens if no one's watching your live stream? Should you wait for people to get there or try doing it at a different time? So it's kind of
sure.
A little bigger question.
Recommendations for best format. Live interviews, I feel like one of the big areas, or one of the big missed opportunities in live interviews that I've seen is just a lack of content preparation. I think people focus too much on the sort of the question or the main subject matter and just let it riff. I think that works when you're sitting on a stage and there's an actual physical engagement component. For as much as live interviews and live video is of value in the certain current circumstances that we're in, there's still a sort of a disconnect element to it. So if you're simply going to jump into an interview where it's just the two of you chatting away, it's not going to, people are looking for value. There's more than enough content out there for me to occupy my entire day. So really setting up the interview ahead of time, having questions outlined, having a key extensive set of topics that you can talk about beforehand, and then dive into it. You need to have a prepared set of takeaways that people can walk away with in an interview. As far as formats go, I'm a huge fan of Zoom. I've really enjoyed those recordings, the invitations. If you're talking about live video, as of late, I've been much more partial to Instagram Live than I have to Facebook Live, just because there's something so much more personal on Instagram, because it's exclusively being shared on your phone and people are looking right at it. The key there is that formats need to be a lot shorter. And to your question, to the second question, Roberta, about whether or not if people aren't there, it's not, the thing about live video, especially with social, is that this isn't really a tree falls in the forest scenario, because there's still, 5 billion other people who may jump in and listen at some other point. So you want to keep in mind that the video content that's being shared live is only live while it's live. It's still going to live on your channels. It's still going to be housed in your content repository forever. So whether or not someone's there, that's not necessarily a bad thing if no one's there, because people may watch it after you've shared it. You may be able to distribute it over email. You may be able to distribute it through boosted content on your social channel. So there are still a lot of options that exist for sharing that content and getting people to see it. That being said, you don't want to ever point out that there's nobody watching, so you're going to turn it off. You should always just pretend that you've got an audience of 1,000 there. And,
Corey, one last question, and then I'm going to wrap this up. This came in from Lisa Pasamonte Green, who's going to be conducting the TEA Throwback Thursday. I'll give you some promo on that later, Lisa. But is there a preferred platform for B2B engagement? We've had some advisors say use LinkedIn versus Facebook, and others say the exact opposite. Does this data say one versus the other?
So that's a really good question, because obviously the presumption would be that LinkedIn is going to be the go-to for anything B2B. There's been a 55% increase in engagement on LinkedIn in the last 2 months. So obviously LinkedIn has become a huge value add for B2B. That said, it really is a question of who your content is targeting and the type of content that's being created. So if you're creating, let's say you're posting a webinar series or a Q&A series that is geared specifically towards an industry, you're zeroing in on the industry as a whole, and you want to share that with professionals from that industry who are interested in the information. Well, sharing content like that to LinkedIn groups is obviously going to have a lot more immediate value than Facebook, because Facebook, one of the things I've mentioned to people, and I've mentioned it to you too, Roberta, is that if you look at my Facebook profile and you look at my LinkedIn profile, you'll swear that I'm two completely different people. I'm certainly not the same person from one channel to another. So you really want to make sure that it's more about the content and how the content's structured than it is about which one is better in general. If it's a fireside chat and you're just sitting around talking about life, love, and whatever industry you're in, you're probably going to be leaning more towards Facebook. If you have a series of questions that are being answered for a specific industry, then LinkedIn's probably going to be a better asset for you in that case.
Good. Thank you so much, Corey. We're coming up on that 9 o'clock hour to have another cup of coffee. But thank you. Thank you. Also, for everybody that's on the Zoom today, Corey is preparing a document that will answer all your questions, plus there's some additional questions I know that several of you have. Feel free to get those to us, and we'll get Corey to answer them. Secondly, Corey's going to send us out a checklist that I think is going to be invaluable for what we're doing in our professional lives now. And third, the recording of today's presentation is going to be available on the TEA website. Now, saying that, Corey, and saying that thank you to everybody that's attended today, let me promote what Lisa's going to be doing tomorrow, because the TEA is going to have a Facebook Throwback Thursday watch party. That's one big long sentence. Featuring visual terrains, Lisa Pesamonte Green moderating the live chat around the TE Masters panel from SATE. And those of you who are not familiar with SATE, it's the Storytelling, Architecture, Technology Experience conference that we put on around the world. So tomorrow will be great watching that Throwback Thursday. And thank you, Erica, for putting this all together. You're our tech master, our director of operations. Jenny, of course, thank you to the TEA, and thank you to everybody who attended today's session. Truly appreciate your time, your energy, your enthusiasm, and your questions. And hope to see all of you soon. We're signing off, zooming around the world. We're signing off.
Thanks, everybody.
Now. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.